Driving lessons with my best friend changed everything between us. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a new upload. Every subscription helps us bring more touching, emotional, and unforgettable stories to life. Thank you for supporting our channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. Nobody warns you that the hardest part about learning to drive isn't the traffic. It's realizing the person sitting in the passenger seat has quietly become your favorite destination. Looking back, I should have known that summer was never really about getting my driver's license. It was about everything that happened while my hands trembled on the steering wheel and Ethan Brooks calmly pretended not to notice. At 22 years old, I had somehow managed to survive college without ever learning how to drive. In most places that might have been embarrassing. In our small Oregon town, it felt almost impossible. Everyone drove. Everyone expected you to drive. I was the only guy who still depended on buses, rides from coworkers, and the occasional sympathy of friends whenever it rained. Ethan never complained about picking me up. If anything, he always acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. He worked weekends at a local auto garage, somehow making grease stains look like part of his personality, while finishing his mechanical engineering degree during the week. If something had wheels, Ethan could probably fix it. If something was broken, people naturally looked at him first. That included me more often than I liked to admit. You know, he said one afternoon while tightening the loose strap on his watch, if you actually want that internship in Portland, you're going to need a license. I groaned dramatically from the passenger seat of his faded blue Honda Civic. Can't I just charm public transportation? Ethan laughed, shaking his head. Miles, the bus doesn't care how funny you are. That's honestly rude. He smiled without taking his eyes off the road. Good thing I do. It was such an ordinary sentence that anyone else would have forgotten it 5 seconds later. I didn't. Somehow those 4 words stayed with me long after the traffic light turned green. Maybe because Ethan never threw compliments around carelessly. Every word from him felt earned. The following Saturday, he showed up outside my apartment just after 9 in the morning carrying 2 iced coffees and wearing sunglasses that somehow made him look even more unfairly handsome. Ready? He asked. Absolutely not. Perfect. That's how everyone starts. We drove 25 minutes to an empty shopping mall parking lot where cracked white lines stretched across sun-baked asphalt like faded memories. There were no other cars except a forgotten pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. Ethan climbed out, walked around the hood, and opened the driver's door for me with an exaggerated little bow. Your kingdom awaits. If I crash into a shopping cart, I'm blaming you forever. Deal. I slid behind the wheel, suddenly aware that cars looked much bigger from this side. My heartbeat became strangely loud inside the quiet cabin. Ethan settled into the passenger seat, adjusted nothing, criticized nothing, simply folded one arm across the center console and smiled with the relaxed confidence of someone who genuinely believed I could do this. First lesson, he said softly. You don't have to be perfect today. I looked down at my nervous hands gripping the steering wheel. What if I'm terrible? Ethan shrugged. Then tomorrow you'll be a little less terrible. I laughed despite myself, and somehow that laugh loosened the knot in my chest. Outside, the summer sun reflected off the windshield while a warm breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass through the cracked window. It felt like the beginning of something impossibly ordinary. Neither of us realized we had just stepped onto a road that would take us somewhere neither friendship nor fear had ever managed to reach before. By the third lesson, I had discovered 2 undeniable facts. First, driving was significantly harder than every confident person on the planet made it look. Second, Ethan Brooks possessed the patience of someone who had secretly signed a lifelong contract to tolerate my nonsense. I managed to forget my turn signal 3 intersections in a row, stopped so gently at one stop sign that Ethan joked we had enough time to celebrate a birthday before moving again, and somehow parked at an angle that looked less like a vehicle and more like modern art. Every mistake earned the same reaction. Never a sigh, never an eye roll, just a quiet smile and another explanation that somehow sounded different from the last one. Try again, he would say. You are closer than you think. It became his favorite sentence, and before long I caught myself believing it. We graduated from the empty parking lot to quiet neighborhood streets where tree branches stretched across the road and children rode bicycles under the warm afternoon sun. My hands still tightened around the steering wheel every time another car appeared, but Ethan always noticed before I said anything. "Keep your eyes farther ahead," he reminded me. "The car goes where your attention goes." That sounds suspiciously like life advice. Maybe it is. I laughed, shaking my head. "You practice those lines before picking me up?" "No," he answered. "You just give me plenty of opportunities." Somewhere between missed turns and awkward three-point turns, driving lessons became something else entirely. We stopped at roadside diners because neither of us could resist fresh pie. We argued over which songs deserved to stay on the playlist. We counted old pickup trucks painted unusual colors just to stay entertained during long stretches of quiet road. Every lesson ended with us sitting in the parked car for another 10 or 15 minutes, talking about classes, future jobs, impossible dreams, or absolutely nothing important at all. I started looking forward to those conversations almost more than the driving itself. One Thursday afternoon, the temperature climbed past 85 degrees, and Ethan rolled every window down instead of using the air conditioning. Warm wind rushed through the cabin, carrying the scent of pine trees from the nearby hills. I reached to adjust the rearview mirror just as Ethan leaned over to point at it. Our hands bumped together for less than a second. It should not have mattered. Friends, accidentally touched all the time. But my heart reacted like someone had unexpectedly turned up the volume on an invisible radio inside my chest. Ethan cleared his throat and casually pointed toward the mirror. "You want to see more of the road behind you, not your own face." "That is disappointing," I joked. "I am pretty handsome." He smiled without hesitation. "You are." The words landed so naturally that neither of us seemed prepared for the silence that followed. I stared through the windshield, pretending to study the empty road while wondering why a simple compliment suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Ethan looked out his window as if giving me space to breathe, but I noticed the faint color rising across his cheeks before he reached for the seat belt again. Neither of us mentioned it. Instead, I started the engine, checked my mirrors twice, and slowly pulled onto the quiet street. For the first time since those lessons began, I was no longer afraid of making a wrong turn. I was far more nervous about where my feelings were quietly beginning to lead me. The strange thing about spending hours inside a car with the same person was that eventually the silence stopped feeling empty. It became comfortable, almost familiar, like an old song neither of us needed to sing anymore, because we already knew every word. By the second week of August, Ethan had started trusting me with roads that actually mattered. We drove through quiet neighborhoods, across small bridges, and even onto a two-lane highway where the speed limit jumped to 55 miles per hour. The first time I merged into traffic, I held my breath so long that Ethan finally laughed. "Miles, breathing is still part of driving." I let out the biggest exhale of my life. I knew I forgot something. "You are doing great. You have to stop saying that every time I almost panic." "Why?" he asked. "Because eventually I might believe you." Ethan looked at me for a second before returning his attention to the road ahead. That is kind of the goal. His confidence in me felt almost unsettling. I had spent years assuming I was bad at anything involving cars, directions, or practical life skills. Somehow, Ethan never seemed interested in the version of me that doubted everything. He always talked to the version I had not met yet. One afternoon, we stopped at a small gas station outside town to grab cold drinks. While I struggled with a vending machine that stubbornly refused my dollar bill, a woman around our age smiled at Ethan near the checkout counter. She was friendly, confident, and clearly interested in talking longer than necessary. I expected Ethan to smile back the way polite people usually did. Instead, he answered her questions kindly, wished her a good afternoon, and walked outside carrying 2 bottles of lemonade as though nothing unusual had happened. "You know she was flirting with you, right?" I asked after climbing back into the car. Ethan shrugged while fastening his seat belt. Maybe. That was the most obvious conversation I have ever witnessed. "She seemed nice." "That is all you have to say?" He twisted the cap off his drink. "What else is there?" I stared at him. "You could ask for her number." He smiled faintly. I was not interested. I raised one eyebrow. "You have not been interested in anyone for, what, 3 years?" "Something like that." "Why?" Ethan rested one hand on the dashboard while watching a freight train roll across the crossing ahead of us. The silence lasted long enough for 3 train cars to pass before he finally answered. "Because sometimes there is already someone important enough that everyone else just feels different. My pulse stumbled. Did something happen? He shook his head. Not exactly. Then why not tell them? A soft laugh escaped him, quiet enough that I almost missed it. Because some friendships are worth more than the risk of losing them. The crossing gate lifted, but neither of us moved right away. Cars behind us remained patient, giving the train time to disappear around the bend. I looked out my window, pretending to admire the distant hills while my thoughts refused to stay still. There was someone Ethan had cared about for years. Someone close enough to make every other possibility meaningless. I wondered who they were. I wondered if they knew. Most of all, I wondered why the idea bothered me far more than it should have. I eased the car back onto the road, following the yellow center line stretching toward the horizon. For the first time since our lessons began, the route ahead looked perfectly clear, yet my own heart felt completely impossible to navigate. By the time August began slipping toward September, driving no longer felt like the impossible mountain I had imagined at the start of the summer. It felt like a routine, and somehow routines had a way of quietly becoming memories before anyone noticed. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Ethan pulled up outside my apartment at exactly 6 o'clock. Every lesson started with the same question. Ready? Every time I answered with some variation of, probably not. Somehow, that exchange never got old. One Thursday, after another surprisingly smooth drive through town, Ethan glanced at the fading sunlight and said, "Do you want to keep going?" I looked at the dashboard clock. We have been out for almost 2 hours. I know. He pointed toward the highway leading west. There is a scenic overlook about 30 miles from here. Hardly any traffic this time of day. Good practice. I smiled. Or you just want an excuse to avoid grading your lab reports. Ethan gave me an innocent look that fooled absolutely nobody. Two things can be true. We headed toward the outskirts of town, where the buildings slowly disappeared behind rolling hills and dense evergreens. The road curved gently through the forest, and for the first time since learning to drive, I realized I was paying more attention to the scenery than to my own nerves. The steering wheel no longer felt foreign beneath my hands. My shoulders had relaxed. Even Ethan noticed. "See," he said, "you are driving without overthinking every little thing. Do not jinx it." Too late. We both laughed. The overlook sat on top of a low ridge, facing a wide valley painted gold by the setting sun. I parked the car on my first try, earning an exaggerated round of applause from Ethan that made me bow dramatically from my seat. Thank you, thank you. I would like to thank functioning brakes and clearly painted parking lines. Most importantly, Ethan added, your stubborn refusal to quit. We climbed out and leaned against the wooden fence overlooking miles of forest stretching toward distant blue mountains. A warm breeze drifted across the hill, carrying the scent of pine and dry grass. Somewhere below us, a hawk circled lazily through the evening sky. Neither of us spoke for a while. It was the kind of silence that never asked to be filled. Ethan finally broke it with an unexpected question. Where do you see yourself 5 years from now? I laughed softly. Hopefully employed. Besides that, I thought for a moment. Maybe working in a city. Maybe renting a tiny apartment with terrible windows. Maybe finally feeling like I know what I am doing. You will. I turned toward him. What about you? He rested both hands on the fence, watching the horizon instead of me. I want a garage someday. Your own. He nodded. Small. Honest. Somewhere people trust the work we do. That sounds exactly like you. He smiled, but there was something thoughtful behind it. There is one thing I have never really figured out. What is that? His fingers traced absent circles across the weathered wood. How people know when it is the right time to tell someone they matter more than they probably should. My heartbeat slowed and sped up all at once. I tried to answer, but nothing came. Instead, I looked out across the valley where the last streaks of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills. For reasons I could not explain, the view felt different now. The road that had brought us there suddenly seemed much shorter than the distance separating everything we were saying from everything we were quietly leaving unsaid. When darkness finally settled over the overlook, we climbed back into the car. This time, before I started the engine, neither of us reached for the radio. Somehow the silence between us had already become the most important conversation of the night. The next few days felt different in ways that were almost impossible to explain. Nothing had changed on the surface. Ethan still arrived exactly on time. I still climbed into the driver's seat. We still joked about my habit of checking the mirrors 3 times. before pulling away from the curb. Yet underneath every familiar routine lingered the memory of that evening on the overlook and the question Ethan had never truly answered. Who was the person he believed mattered too much to risk losing? The uncertainty followed me everywhere. It distracted me during lectures, lingered through my shifts at the library, and somehow managed to appear every time my phone lit up with a message from Ethan asking if I was ready for another lesson. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Friends were allowed to care deeply about each other. That was all this was. At least that was the story I kept repeating. Then Saturday arrived. My shift ended earlier than expected, and I decided to stop by the downtown cafe to grab a coffee before heading home. As I waited near the front window, I noticed a familiar blue Honda pulling into a parking space across the street. Ethan stepped out, and before I could wave, someone else climbed out of the passenger side. A young woman about our age smiled warmly as they walked toward the cafe together. She laughed at something Ethan said, and he laughed too, the relaxed kind of laugh I had heard countless times during our drives. Instinctively, I took a step backward, staying just out of sight behind a bookshelf near the entrance. They found a table by the window while I remained frozen where I stood. From where I watched, they looked comfortable together, talking easily, occasionally smiling at each other in the effortless way people did when they genuinely enjoyed someone's company. My chest tightened before I even realized why. I remembered Ethan saying there had been someone important enough that nobody else compared. Suddenly, my imagination filled every blank space with certainty. Of course it was her. Maybe he had simply never been ready to tell me. Maybe today was the beginning of whatever came next for him. Without buying the coffee I had planned on, I quietly left through the side door before either of them could notice me. When my phone buzzed an hour later, I already knew who it was. Ethan had sent a simple message asking if I still wanted to practice Sunday afternoon because my driving test was only a week away. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back that I was feeling tired and thought I should take the day off. His reply came almost immediately. No problem. Get some rest. We can practice another time. The kindness in those words somehow made everything hurt even more. Over the next several days, I found excuses whenever he suggested another lesson. Homework, extra shifts, group projects that did not actually exist. Ethan never argued. He only wished me luck and reminded me that the test was getting closer. Every unanswered conversation left a little more distance between us, and every mile of that distance felt entirely my fault. I had spent the entire summer learning how to steer a car with confidence. Yet somehow I had no idea how to navigate the quiet misunderstandings slowly pulling me away from the person who had believed in me before I ever believed in myself. The week before my driving test arrived with gray skies and steady rain, as though summer itself was reluctant to let go. I kept telling myself I would call Ethan tomorrow. Tomorrow became another tomorrow until nearly 5 days had disappeared between us, longer than we had gone without talking since freshman year. The silence felt unnatural, but admitting why I had created it felt even harder. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang while I was shelving books at the library. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail before answering. "Hey," I said quietly. "Hey," he replied, sounding relieved just to hear my voice. "I know you have been busy, but your test is in 3 days. The weather forecast says more rain is coming. You should practice in it at least once." I hesitated. Every excuse I had invented over the past week suddenly sounded childish. "I guess that makes sense. Can I pick you up in an hour?" There was a warmth in his voice that had not changed despite everything I had imagined. "Okay," I answered. One more lesson. When Ethan arrived, the windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass, brushing away countless drops that immediately returned. Neither of us spoke much during the first few miles. The comfortable silence we once shared had become uncertain, as though we were both waiting for the other person to explain something neither of us fully understood. The rain grew heavier as we reached the highway outside town. Water shimmered across the pavement, and visibility shortened until distant headlights looked like blurred stars. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "Ease up on your grip," Ethan said gently. "The tighter you hold it, the harder it becomes to make smooth corrections." I nodded, trying to relax my shoulders. A strong gust of wind pushed against the side of the car, and I instinctively overcorrected before easing back into the lane. My breathing became shallow. "I cannot do this," I admitted. "Yes, you can," Ethan answered calmly. "Look farther ahead. Do not fight, every raindrop. Trust yourself. Another wave of rain swept across the windshield so suddenly that my confidence disappeared with it. I slowed too quickly, uncertain of everything except the pounding of my own heartbeat. Ethan did not panic. He simply rested one steady hand lightly over mine on the steering wheel, his voice remaining calm and even. You are safe. I am right here. Keep your eyes on the lane. Nice and easy. That is it. Somehow those simple words reached me through the noise of the storm. My breathing gradually steadied. The car remained centered. A few minutes later, the rain eased enough for us to pull into a quiet roadside parking area overlooking an open field. I shifted into park and leaned back against the seat, letting out a long breath I felt as though I had been holding for miles. Ethan turned toward me with the same reassuring smile that had carried me through every lesson since summer began. See, he said softly. You handled it. I shook my head. No, we handled it. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. I never doubted you, Miles. Not for a second. Something inside me cracked open. Before I could overthink it, I reached across the center console and wrapped my arms around him in a grateful embrace that lasted only a few quiet seconds. Ethan returned it without hesitation, gentle and steady, as naturally as every lesson that had brought us here. When we finally pulled back, neither of us spoke immediately. The rain had almost stopped, leaving tiny drops sparkling across the windshield while the clouds slowly gave way to fading evening light. For the first time all week, the distance between us no longer felt measured in miles. It felt measured only by one conversation that could no longer be postponed. Neither of us moved for several seconds after the embrace ended. The quiet inside the car felt completely different from the silence that had surrounded us all week. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was simply honest, waiting patiently for one of us to say what had been hiding between every unfinished sentence since the summer began. Tiny drops of rain continued sliding down the windshield while the last light of the evening broke through the clouds, covering the empty field beyond the parking area with a soft golden glow. Ethan let out a slow breath and rested both hands loosely on his knees. I have been trying to figure out what happened, he admitted. You disappeared all week, and I kept wondering if I had said something wrong. I looked down at my hands, embarrassed by how small the truth suddenly sounded. You did not. Then what was it? I hesitated before forcing myself to answer. I saw you at the cafe downtown last Saturday. Ethan blinked once, clearly surprised. The cafe? You were with a woman. His expression changed almost instantly from confusion to realization. Then, to my complete surprise, he laughed softly and shook his head. Miles. What? That was my cousin, Emma. She flew in from Colorado for a family reunion. She wanted coffee before meeting everyone else. I stared at him in complete disbelief. Your cousin? My cousin, he repeated with an amused smile. She even asked about you because I talk about you all the time. Every assumption I had carefully built over the past week collapsed in an instant. I covered my face with one hand and groaned. I cannot believe I avoided you because of that. Ethan's smile faded into something much gentler. You thought she was the person I cared about. I nodded slowly. When you told me there had been someone important for years, I thought maybe you had finally decided to be with her. He became quiet again, his eyes lingering on the rain-speckled windshield. No, he said at last. The person I was talking about has never been Emma. My heartbeat returned with astonishing force. Ethan turned toward me, his voice steady despite the nervous smile slowly appearing across his face. Do you remember what I asked you at the Overlook? About knowing when someone matters too much to stay silent. I nodded. I was talking about you. The words settled gently between us, almost too simple after months of uncertainty. Ethan continued before I could respond. I never planned for it to happen. Somewhere between late-night study sessions, terrible cafeteria food, helping you move apartments, and teaching you how to drive, you became the first person I wanted to tell every piece of good news to. Every time someone suggested I should start dating, I compared them to you without even realizing it. Eventually, I understood why nobody else ever felt right. I searched for something meaningful to say, but every sentence seemed too small. Finally, I laughed quietly through the emotion building in my chest. You know what the worst part is? Ethan tilted his head. What? I spent the entire week convincing myself I needed to get over feelings that apparently never needed getting over in the first place. Ethan laughed with me, the familiar sound instantly dissolving the last traces of distance between us. I reached across the center console, and this time instead of uncertainty, I simply took his hand. He held mine with quiet confidence, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the storm had completely passed. A narrow rainbow stretched across the evening sky above the open field, and for the first time all summer, the road ahead no longer felt like a question. It finally felt like home. The morning of my driving test arrived with clear blue skies, as though the storm from 2 days earlier had carried every lingering doubt away with it. I woke up before my alarm, not because I was nervous about parallel parking or traffic signs, but because I kept replaying the conversation Ethan and I had shared after the rain. Nothing about our friendship had disappeared. Somehow it had simply become more honest. When I stepped outside my apartment, Ethan was already waiting beside his blue Honda, holding 2 cups of iced coffee exactly the way he had on the first day he offered to teach me. He smiled the moment he saw me. Ready? I laughed because the question suddenly meant so much more than driving. This time I think I actually am. The testing center was about 20 minutes away. During the drive, we talked about everything except the exam. Ethan told me about a customer at the garage who had accidentally locked his keys inside a truck that was still running. I told him one of the children visiting the library had confidently informed me that dinosaurs probably enjoyed peanut butter sandwiches. We laughed the entire way there, and somewhere between those ordinary conversations, I realized my hands were no longer shaking. Ethan noticed before I did. "You are calmer today," he said. "That is because I finally have the best driving instructor in the state." He pretended to consider that for a moment. I will accept that completely unbiased opinion. When we reached the testing center, I climbed out of the car and looked toward the line of applicants waiting near the office entrance. Some paced nervously. Others reviewed handbooks one last time. Ethan stood beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets. "Remember," he said, "the examiner is not looking for perfection. They are looking for someone who makes safe decisions." I nodded. That sounds familiar. Maybe because I have said it about 100 times. Before my name was called, I turned toward him. "Thank you." He smiled. "For what?" "For every lesson. For believing I could do this before I believed it myself." His expression softened. That part was always easy. The examiner introduced herself, checked my paperwork, and invited me to begin. Ethan stayed exactly where he was in the parking lot, offering nothing more than a quiet thumbs up as I pulled away. Every mile of the route felt strangely familiar. Smooth turns, careful lane changes, complete stops, calm breathing. Whenever uncertainty tried to return, I heard Ethan's voice in my memory reminding me to look farther ahead instead of staring at what frightened me. 25 minutes later, I parked back at the testing center and waited while the examiner finished writing her notes. Finally, she looked up with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Miles. You passed." For a second, I could only blink. Then I thanked her, accepted the temporary license she handed me, and hurried back across the parking lot. Ethan was already walking toward me, searching my face for the answer before I even spoke. I lifted the paper into the air with a grin that probably could have been seen from the next county. "I did it." Ethan laughed and opened his arms without saying another word. I stepped into the embrace, and this time it felt less like celebrating a test and more like celebrating every quiet mile that had brought us here. As we pulled back, I looked at him and smiled. "You know," I said, "getting my license was supposed to be the biggest thing that happened this summer." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Was supposed to be?" I reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Turns out finding the person I want beside me on every road ahead matters a whole lot more." A week after I passed my driving test, Ethan handed me a folded road map with a grin that immediately made me suspicious. "What is this?" I asked. "Our first trip where you do all the driving," he replied. "No lessons. No practice. Just 2 people with a full tank of gas and know where they absolutely have to be." Early Saturday morning, we left town before most people had finished breakfast. The highway stretched ahead beneath a bright September sky, while golden fields slowly gave way to forests and winding mountain roads. For the first time since climbing behind the wheel that summer, I did not think about every movement I made. My hands rested naturally on the steering wheel. I checked my mirrors without reminding myself. I merged onto the highway with quiet confidence. Every mile felt less like a test and more like freedom. Ethan noticed almost immediately. "You have stopped asking if you are doing it right," he said. I smiled without taking my eyes off the road. Maybe because someone spent an entire summer convincing me I could. He leaned comfortably against the passenger seat. Good. That means my job is officially finished. We stopped at a roadside diner overlooking a peaceful lake where the waitress insisted we try the homemade blueberry pie because, according to her, nobody should leave disappointed. She was right. We laughed over coffee, argued playfully about whose music deserved control of the playlist for the drive home, and watched families launch small boats from the nearby dock. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary, yet somehow every ordinary moment carried a new meaning now that neither of us had to hide what we felt. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves back on another quiet scenic overlook, not very different from the one where everything had nearly changed weeks before. This time there were no unanswered questions waiting between us. We stood beside the wooden fence watching sunlight dance across the trees below. Do you remember your first lesson? Ethan asked. I laughed immediately. I remember being convinced I was going to destroy your car before leaving the parking lot. You also asked what would happen if you were terrible. I nodded. And you told me tomorrow I would be a little less terrible. Ethan smiled. Turns out that advice worked for more than driving. I looked at him, realizing how true those words really were. Every conversation, every missed turn, every awkward silence, every misunderstanding had quietly taught us how to become more honest with each other. The road had never simply been about learning to drive. It had been teaching us to trust where our hearts were already leading. As the sun slowly settled toward the horizon, we returned to the car. Hanging from the rear window was the faded student driver sign Ethan had kept there throughout every practice session. I reached back, carefully removed it, folded it in half, and placed it inside the trunk before closing it with a quiet smile. Ethan watched me with curious eyes. Retiring it, he asked. I nodded. I do not need it anymore. He opened the passenger door before looking back at me. No, he said warmly. You do not. We climbed into the car, and this time there was no instructor and no student. Only two people beginning a new chapter together. I started the engine, reached across the center console until our hands found each other naturally, and guided the car onto the open highway. The road ahead stretched beyond the horizon, full of places we had never seen and memories we had not made yet. But for the first time, neither of us cared where the journey ended, because after everything that summer had taught us, we already knew the most important part of every trip would always be the person waiting in the seat beside us.